welcome. I, Vikas Chaube, welcome you all uh, to this beautiful city of Dehradun and the same beautiful occasion, Valley of Words. So, in this session with VoW Awardees, as you already might have seen the brochures and the details of the programs, uh, we'll be having a discussion uh, on the book uh, by respected Rudrangshu Mukherjee sir, Tagore and Gandhi, Walking Alone and Walking Together. Uh, Friends, as you all know, और जहाँ तक मेरी समझ जाती है कि हमारे सभी एस्टीम्ड पैनलिस्ट किसी परिचय के मोहताज नहीं हैं. वी आर दे आर वेल नोन फिगर्स, बट टू जैसी की रवायत है, प्रोफेसर रुद्रांशु मुखर्जी इज अ एमिनेंट हिस्टोरियन, ऑथर, academician and chancellor Ashoka University. He is a public intellectual and he has written a lot of books on the history and other disciplines also. So sir, we welcome you here. Please guys have a big round of applause for Rudranshu sir. And chairing this session, we have a well-known author, Sahitya Academy winner, renowned columnist, Ira Pande ma'am. So I'll request, please have a big round of applause for Ira ma'am. Ma'am, we welcome you. और इसके बाद हमारे साथ प्रोफेसर सतीश एकांत जी हैं, जो इंग्लिश भाषा, अंग्रेजी भाषा के मर्मज्ञ होने के साथ साथ ही इज़ अ क्रिटिक एंड पोस्ट colonial scholar. So to take the proceeding further, we'll be having Professor Satish with us. Please have a big round of applause for Professor Satish. Sir, we welcome you. दोस्तों, इससे पहले कि हम इस सत्र की शुरुआत करें, भारत में हमेशा से आदिकाल से एक स्वस्थ परंपरा रही है पब्लिक डिबेट और इंटेलेक्चुअल जो बौद्धिक हमारी संपदा है वो कैसे फली फूली चर्चा परिचर्चा. और अगर आप अपनी पूरी इंडियन माइथोलॉजी और भारतीय संस्कृति को खंगालते हैं तो आप पाएंगे कि ज़्यादातर आपके ज्ञान का जो स्रोत रहा है वो लोगों का आपसी संवाद रहा है. आप पूरी माइथोलॉजी उठा लीजिए, चाहे वो अर्जुन और कृष्ण का संवाद देखें या अन्य किसी प्रकार के संवाद देखें. तो यहाँ पे मैं विशेष धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करना चाहूँगा टू द क्यूरेटर ऑफ वैली ऑफ वर्ड्स, डॉक्टर संजीव चोपड़ा सर. गाइज प्लीज हैव अ बिग राउंड ऑफ अप्लॉज फॉर डॉक्टर संजीव सर. क्योंकि जो किस्सा गोई और जो परिचर्चा और आपसी संवाद की परंपरा है उसी को वैली ऑफ वर्ड्स आगे बढ़ाता है. तो ये एक बहुत सुखद एहसास देता है जब हम इस तरीके की बौद्धिक चर्चाओं के माध्यम से समाज का किस प्रकार विकास हो सके उस मंतव्य के साथ आगे बढ़ते हैं. सो गाइज, नाउ कमिंग टू द बुक, बिफोर वी फॉर्मली स्टार्ट विद दिस सेशन. This book is important as far as I understood this book, not only because it introduces and explores two of the best person of modern Indian thinking, Tagore and Gandhi, but it is important in a manner that it takes us to the inclusive and assimilative idea, and the idea of India which we have read from earlier days, like starting with Hind Swaraj, and you have idea of India, then you go to history, so you have the wonder that was India, John Key, everyone. So over generations people have understood this idea of India in different manner, but yet there is some common fabric that celebrating unity in diversity, which is the theme of Value of Words also. So in both the respects this book is phenomenal and it's important for each and everyone. So without wasting any further movement, तो दोस्तों आइए जानते हैं और समझते हैं इस पुस्तक के माध्यम से मेरे अनुसार जो भारत की दो सबसे खूबसूरत सौगात रही दुनिया को, टैगोर और गांधी. तो now to take the things further, I would request Professor Satish Aikant ji to start the conversations in this sessions. Thank you.
Professor, I'm sorry to intervene like this, but before both of you get into conversation with each other, I just want to place on record how honored I am to be sitting here between two such big scholars, not just big in terms of their reputation, but in terms of the work and the perspectives they have brought into modern history and into critical thinking. Both Rudrangshu Mukherjee and Professor Aikant have written extensively on theory and concepts. But what I admire in the work of both these people is that very often we find that when professors and eminent scholars like them write books, they write for other scholars. Very often, the ordinary lay reader or the intelligent lay reader who would like to know in simple terms what the basic problems and the conflicts between two perspectives are, they get somewhere lost because you cannot be obviously connected to the world that they are connected. So I'm looking forward to listening for all of us, me particularly, a conversation between them on how there can be differences, but there are also resolutions, there are also commonalities, and what is more, there is civility in that dialogue, something that we are now fast losing. Everything is confrontational. You're either on this side or on that side. The binaries have become so sharply established by now that the confluence of ideas is getting severely impacted. So I hope that both Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee and Dr. Aikant will be able to tell us about how two people who were eminent and extraordinary people in their own way, both Gandhiji and Tagore, had differences, severe differences between them on certain aspects of looking at the world, on nationalism, on education, on all kinds of other issues, but how they managed to hold this with deep respect for each other. So I'll now invite Dr. Aikant to start off.
Thank you, Vita. I think we have some Shanti Niketan, if I may so say so, Tagore effect here. Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, of course, is a great Tagore scholar. And Tagore is also identified with Shanti Niketan so profusely. Ira Pande, of course, has translated a work by her mother, Shivani, which is Amir Shanti Niketan. And both of them are awardees, VoW awardees. So I think, as Polonius in Hamlet said, we are blessed twice, and being blessed twice to have twice the grace. Of course, I can't stretch this comparison too far. It would not be proper. We are discussing the work by Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, which is Tagore and Gandhi, walking alone, walking together. We know that the two of them were the towering personalities in the 20th century, and the two of them were also contrasting personalities, and in several ways they also complemented each other. Let me begin with what Nehru said about this relationship. This was, by the way, a very long relationship which lasted about 2.5 decades, ever since Gandhi came to Shanti Niketan in 1914-15, and the relationship lasted up to Tagore's death in 1941. Now, Nehru has this to say on Tagore. No two persons could be so different from one another in their makeup or temperaments. Tagore, the aristocratic artist turned democrat with proletarian sympathies, represented essentially the cultural tradition of India, the tradition of accepting life in the fullness thereof and going through it with song and dance. Gandhi, more a man of the people, almost the embodiment of the Indian peasant, represented the other ancient tradition of India, that of renunciation and asceticism, and yet Tagore was primarily the man of thought, Gandhi of concentrated and ceaseless activity, both in their different ways, had a world outlook, and both were at the same time wholly Indian. They seemed to present different but harmonious aspects of India and to complement one another. And toward the end of the book, Professor Mukherjee remarks about Gandhi. At the end of December 1945 in Shanti Niketan, Gandhi said he had gone to Shanti Niketan one last time after Tagore's death, and he said, I have found no real conflict between us. I started with the disposition to detect a conflict between Gurudev and myself, but ended with the discovery that there was one. But of course, this could also be a rather simplistic observation by Gandhi himself, because there were certain sharp differences during their interaction, and we look forward to discussing those things, how those differences arose. But first of all, let me ask Professor Mukherjee how that when Gandhi first visited Tagore in Shantiniketan 1914 or 1915, uh, Tagore was already a Nobel laureate, having received the Nobel Prize in 1913, and Gandhi was not known so nationally, although he had uh, developed a unique brand of satyagraha or passive resistance in South Africa, and he had initiated great activism there. But in India, he was not so well known as a political activist. So, what is it that really drew Tagore to Gandhi?
Uh, the answer is twofold. One is related to events, and the other is related to one particular individual who actually forms a third side to the Gandhi Tagore relationship. I'll talk about the events first. Sometime in 1914, Gandhi took the rather momentous decision that he would uh, pull up stumps in South Africa and return to India. Uh, this decision had been brewing in his mind for some time because in 1909 he wrote that famous text Hind Swaraj. Even though he was still living in South Africa, working in South Africa, the book was entirely about India. So obviously he was thinking about India, the future of India, and so on. So in 1914 he took the decision, and the problem that arose, the practical problem that arose was what is going to happen to the children who studied with Gandhi in Tolstoy farm? Where were they going to go in India? Where were they to be located? And this is where also the individual I was talking about comes into prominence.
Was it the Phoenix Farm?
Phoenix Farm
Phoenix
and
Farm.
Tolstoy Farm, both.
Yeah.
Phoenix Farm, yeah. So the person concerned is, of course, Charles Freer Andrews, who in India is famous as Dinobandhu Andrews. Andrews had heard Tagore in London reciting from the Gitanjali in Rothstein's house, and he had been completely enamored by Tagore's reading and the poems and songs of Gitanjali. And this was one of the factors that made that made Andrews come to India, and he decided to work in Shantiniketan with Tagore, and or as Andrews always called him, as did Gandhi indeed, Gurudev. So, but before Andrews could join Rabindranath in Shantiniketan, he was called away to South Africa at the behest of Gokhale and also at the behest of Gandhi. And it is from Andrews that Gandhi first heard about Rabindranath, the work that he was doing in Shantiniketan, about his poetry, about his novels, about his writings, and in fact, Andrews gave to Rabindranath, or gave to Gandhi a copy of, presented to Gandhi, a copy of a translation of Rabindranath's novel Ghore Baire, The Home and the World. And later he was to give the play called Dark Khor, Post Office. I've been very fortunate actually to see that copy of Dark Khor, which Andrews presented to Gandhi with Rabindranath's signature, to Mahatma Ji from Rabindranath. The copy is with Gandhi's grandson, Gopal Gandhi, who showed it to me. It was an absolute privilege to hold that copy of the post office in my hands. But personal reason, things apart. So this is how Gandhi gets to know about Rabindranath, the writer, the educationist, the intellectual, and from Andrews. And he decides, with no special pleading from Andrews, that the boys of Tolstoy Farm and Phoenix Farm would actually come to Shantiniketan. That would be their home in India. And that's what happens. And the boys come there. And in January 1915, Gandhi comes to see the boys. But he has to leave after 2 days. When he arrives, Rabindranath is not there. He was in Calcutta, in Jorashankar, in his ancestral house. But Gandhi couldn't stay because he got the news that Gopal Krishna Gokhale had died, his mentor. And so he left Shantiniketan. So he came back a few weeks later. And that's where the first meeting between the two of them took place. And to use a cliche, it was love at first sight. And but like many relationships of love, affection, and respect, it was not entirely smooth. The critical point of difference, and this is a difference that lasted right through their lives, articulating itself in various different ways. Gandhi wrote to Andrews, he said, "These boys are wonderful, but they have been taught to obey. They have no inner spirit of their own. Discipline has been so imposed upon them that they have lost their childhood. And the sense of play, the sense of fun, they have lost." And so he was not quite approving of Gandhi's imposition of discipline, and their ideas about discipline began on two different trajectories as well. Gandhi believed that discipline could be imposed from above, should be imposed from above. And on the contrary, Rabindranath always believed that discipline had to be something organic. You had to cultivate discipline from within yourself and not something that was externally imposed. This is a strand of difference that remains with the two of them without ever becoming acrimonious. So that moment, that first moment of meeting was both affectionate, very respectful, but not without that discordant note, as it were, about the role of discipline in the lives of human beings.
Thank you. You referred to Hindu Swaraj, Mahatma Gandhi, and you rightly said that it was more about India than it was about South Africa, where it was being written. And Hindu Swaraj, of course, is the seminal text of Gandhian studies. It deals crucially with the question of freedom. And more than freedom, it is about Swaraj, decolonizing and how to derive Swaraj. And Swaraj both as self-rule and self-government. And Gandhi, I think, crucially makes the distinction between self-rule and the self-government. because self-government would be identified with the state, and Gandhi does not give much priority to the state. Now, Hindu Swaraj is also concerned with the denunciation of what he calls the modern civilization. It is not exactly, or it's not identical with the Western civilization, it is more crucially the modern civilization, and Gandhi attacks that modern civilization. Now, when we talk of modern civilization, we start with the notion of modernity, and the notion of modernity which comes to us through the Enlightenment ethos, Enlightenment, rationality, and so on. So, how did Tagore view modernity in that context? For Gandhi, anything to do with modernity was a taboo, because he thinks that the outward manifestation of modernity, you know, kind of a violence which is associated with that, he would never go along with that. So this condemnation of modernity was almost total. But Tagore negotiates modernity, because Tagore thinks that modernity also has certain aspects which can be embraced, right? And therefore it has not to be totally abdicated. So do you think that his notion of modernity was in contrast with Gandhi's notion of modernity in Hind Swaraj?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. First of all, I agree with you that in the Hind Swaraj, Gandhi uh, plays with the two meanings of the word Swaraj. Swaraj as political independence from British rule, and Swaraj as regulating the self, Swaraj. He deliberately does that, and he also points out how one complements. Yeah. So they are in Gandhi's mind. These are the two meanings, the two resonances. Rather, meaning is rather restrictive word. The two resonances of Swaraj are interrelated. I mean, you cannot free the self if politically you are ruled by a foreign and alien power. And freedom from a foreign and alien power is substanceless unless the self is free. So he relates the two of them. I would like to just qualify a little bit the point that Satish made just now. Modernity, yes, but Gandhi also locates this modernity in the West. Therefore, for him, Western civilization and modern civilization are somewhat synonymous because he relates modernity with industrialism or industrialization, and which is happening in the West from the late 18th and particularly in the 19th century. And he, as he says, it came to India or piggyback on British rule, and the British brought modern ideas, modern institutions, modern economic practices to India. And in Gandhi's mind, there is no manner of doubt that if India has to attain Swaraj in both senses of the term, then India and Indians have to reject modern / Western civilization wholesale. No compromises. Tagore's, as you say, response is a little nuanced and is not as cast in stone as Gandhi's is. I say cast in stone because as late as December 1945, in a letter to Nehru, Gandhi writes, before I say what he writes, Uh, it's important to point out here that his closest, if not one of his closest, I would like to think his closest, and his chosen heir, Jawaharlal Nehru, was the strongest and the sternest critique of the ideas contained in the Hind Swaraj. In his autobiography in 1935, Nehru writes that the doctrines of the Hind Swaraj are a dangerous doctrine. That's the word he uses. I'm not coining that criticism. A dangerous doctrine. It will take India backwards, not forwards. Out in the open, this is another point, Ira was saying everything is confrontational and acrimonious today. But look at this. I mean, two people, teacher, disciple, guru, shishya, however, son, father, I mean, however you want to define that relationship, out in the open in print, Nehru doesn't hesitate to articulate, express his differences with Gandhi. Gandhi obviously read the autobiography, and he never held it against Nehru that there was this very sharp difference between the two of them on very fundamental issues. So in 1945, with this in background, Nehru's criticism in background, and obviously the letter I'm going to quote will tell you, suggests that they had many discussions together on the Hind Swaraj. Gandhi writes, and he says that you and I have had many differences on the Hind Swaraj, and I know what your criticisms of the Hind Swaraj are. But let me tell you that even if I were the last man standing, even if I were the last man standing, I will still stand by what I wrote in the Hind Swaraj. So there's no retraction, no recanting. That's why I say, in Gandhi's mind, it's cast in stone. That's why I, contrary to the greatest authority, living authority, with two magisterial volumes on Gandhi's life, my friend Ramchandra Guha, contrary to his views, I actually think that Hind Swaraj is the central text of Gandhi's life. If there is a central text to Gandhi's life, it is Hind Swaraj. Sorry? No, Ram Guha. Ram Guha. Ram Guha, if you notice the biographies, he doesn't spend too much time on the Hind Swaraj. And he actually doesn't believe Gandhi's life has a central text. That's where I differ from him. But anyway, that's a complete digression. So, Gandhi stands firm on what he wrote on the Hind Swaraj. He doesn't change his views from between 1909 and 1948. For 40 years, that's where he is, that's where he stands. As I said, Tagore's views are a little nuanced. He begins early in his life, well, not really early, he's 30, 40 years old when he's writing these essays with a similar rejection of modern institutions that the British had brought to India. Almost similar institutions. And the other great similarity between the two of them is that if India, both believe that if India has to be rebuilt, a new India has to be born, it cannot emanate from urban/Western civilization. India can only be rebuilt from her villages. This is where the real India lives. This is where the real India endures. So Rabindranath, from around the turn of the century, begins to devote himself to what he calls village reconstruction, or he says in one essay, I think, roughly translated, it is micro-Swaraj, he says. So I begin at the villages, at the local, very local level. And what is that? What do we do with, what do we do in these villages? He says, Atma Shakti, build up Atma Shakti among the people of the poor common folk who live in these villages. Their lives are, he writes, completely dependent on institutions that are external to the village. The power of the landlord, the power of the moneylender, the power of the state. So even if a well has to be built for drinking water, the villagers are dependent on one or all three of these external agencies. And Rabindranath says, let's give them that inner strength, Atma Shakti, moral strength, where they can be, or they can be at the command of their own agency. They will be conscious of their own agency, and therefore they'll be able to regulate and take their own decisions. This is something that Gandhi says that in 1909, that individuals have to have control and regulating powers over their own lives and not depend on the state. In a very wry but appreciative statement, I think to his son, Rabindranath, to Rabindranath Tagore, who has very strong Dehradun connections, Rabindranath wrote, I'm very glad and relieved that Mohtaji has taken up work in the villages. I began it many, many years ago. So there is again this convergence that the India has to be rebuilt from the villages. So, but from this, if you like, it's a bad word to use, term to use, but no other word comes to mind immediately. From this rural isolationism, Tagore moves, especially in the second decade of the 19th century, second decade of the 20th century, to an embracing of the world, not just of the West. Open up the minds of India and Indians to influences that come from anywhere. Bishop Bharati, where India meets the world, not the West, not just the West, where India meets the world. He chooses this name very deliberately. And again he emphasizes, when he is choosing scholars to come to teach in Shantiniketan, he drew them from across India, students as well. Shivani is a good example. And others who came from across the world to teach. Tansen came from China. Stella Kramrisch came all the way from the United States. Yes, Alex Roy Aronson, and so on. I mean, a whole galaxy of people. Looking at Vishwabharati today, which has become a small district university in Bengal, one wouldn't imagine that at one time it was a place where, in fact, India met the world and the world met India. And it was presided over, of course, by this towering personality who was a poet of the people. If Rabindranath was anything, he was a poet of the people. Tagore himself. So there is this shift that is taking place from Rabindranath. He is willing to believe that what is unique to India and India's villages can actually be merged together, be fused together with ideas that are coming from across the world, from different parts of the world. And he walks the talk, as the jargon goes these days, because he tries to do this not only in the field of education in Vishwabharati, and he also tries to do this in village reconstruction, in the experiment in Sriniketan, which is a group of villages named Sriniketan by Rabindranath himself, a group of Santal villages, in fact tribal villages, that he helps to reconstruct. Significant point two individuals whose sensibilities we almost automatically associate with European / modern sensibilities. Both of them are rooted in Shantiniketan. One, of course, is Satyajit Ray, and the other is Amartya Sen. I think they exemplify the best of what Tagore tried to do.
That's a wonderful summation of his views. Now, when we discuss Tagore and Gandhi together, we cannot help but refer to nationalism, the idea of nationalism, which is inherent in their outlook. Now, Tagore, of course, was very critical of nationalism, and when he criticizes nationalism, he almost identified it with the nation state, a nation state which he called that it was a pernicious export from the West. But Gandhi thinks that he was a nationalist, Tagore was a nationalist, but he said that before one becomes international, one has to be international. So that is the route to it. And then we do see that Tagore embraces that cosmopolitan outlook. But there is one question, when Gandhi rejects West, he does not reject all of the West. There is also, because he thinks that there is a certain stream of West which is prior to the modern West, which is the other West, the West of Thoreau and Whitman and others. Now, does Tagore also make this kind of a distinction, or he thinks that everything that is coming from the West has to be embraced?
No, he doesn't. But where is Rabindranath not a nationalist? I think it's very important to understand that. Nationalism has imbibed in it a sense of superiority. My nation is the best, and therefore other nations are inferior, and sometimes that spills over to the loathing or the hatred of other nations. These are ideas that are associated with nationalism. It is, after all, a hyper form of nationalism that results in Nazism and fascism, and a hyper form of nationalism that leads to people like Macaulay and Bentinck to believe that Indians are barbaric, inferior, they have no culture, etc., etc. So there is this strand of nationalism that Tagore refused to accept, and he believed that more than the nation, humanity is more important. Think of all human beings. Just don't think of the people who are around you within the same nation state. In many ways, I like to think that without knowing it, or E.M. Foster, who was very familiar with Tagore's writings and with some of Tagore's ideas, when E.M. Foster said that if I were to choose between my country and my friend, I hope I'll have the courage to choose my friend. He was actually echoing Tagore. So, Rabindranath had this dimension that human beings come first. So, if you look at that letter that he writes after the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh, rejecting his knighthood, what are the terms in which he is describing this act? That this is something that is inhuman. No human being should do this to any other human being. And how can you, as a civilized, quote unquote, civilized people, do this in India? You represent barbarism. That word barbaric is used in that letter, actually. So he is actually criticizing British rule in terms of the whole of humanity, not just from the point of view of an Indian.
He was the first of the award Wapsi gang when he returned his knighthood, so to say.
And it's interesting, again a digression, sorry, but history is full of what, in the words of T.S. Eliot, full of cunning corridors.
Yes.
So many digressions. Nehru is made by Chittaranjan Das, who heads the Congress committee for the wrongs done in Punjab. Chittaranjan Das requests his old friend Motilal Nehru. He says, why don't you give me your son to draft the report? He has come back from Cambridge, he's not doing very much. His English, I'm told, is very good, so he need not be part of the committee, but he can come with me and he can help me draft the report. And so Nehru goes with that committee to Punjab, and he sees for himself, he hears for himself what had happened. And on the basis of that evidence, he writes 3 articles. I think it's in the Bombay Chronicle, where actually in 1919, Nehru also uses the term barbaric. He said, this is a barbaric regime, and India has no future unless this barbaric regime is thrown out. This is even before he comes under the influence of Gandhi.
Exactly. Would you like to?
Time now for a few questions, maybe?
But could I, Ira, with your permission, I began, thanks to Satish, with this point about the differences that Rabindranath and Gandhi had on this very critical point of discipline. I want to trace that discipline, trace that difference. Where does it come from? And I do so in the last chapter of my book, in the last few pages of my book. But for those of you who haven't read the book and may not have the time to read it in the future, I just want to make this point. This difference is somewhat related, or that's my argument, to the 2 different notions of piety that they had. Both were very pious people, very profoundly pious. Rabindranath's piety was rooted in the Upanishads. And therefore, he imbibed from the Upanishads this notion of interiority, particularly from one dialogue in the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, where what is internal, what is close to one's heart is the most important thing. And that's what's crucial for the identity of a human being. Whereas the book of Gandhi's life is not the Upanishad, it's the Bhagavad Gita, where in fact Krishna is telling Arjuna through a series of dialogues, questions and answers, doubts being clarified, which Gandhi actually picks up. The Hind Swaraj is not often underlined, is written in a dialogic form. It is a dialogue that is taking place between a reader and an editor. So it is modeled on the form of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, what is Krishna saying in the end? You have no choice in the matter. This is your moral duty. And this moral duty has already been assigned to you, and assigned to you by me. In the 11th chapter, that's exactly what he says in the Bhagavad Gita. Look into my mouth. What's the choice? Nothing. Vishwarup Darshan. And Arjun is, of course, completely awestruck. And he utters those famous words which Oppenheimer quoted when he saw the first atom bomb being burst in the Los Alamos desert. He was on the watchtower. And he said, When a splendor brighter than 1,000 suns shall burst into the sky, that will be like the splendor of the mighty one. And Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, 2 verses down, says in response to that, I have become death, the conqueror of worlds, which also Oppenheimer quoted. So, again, a digression to Oppenheimer. But the main point is that in that 11th chapter, that you have no agency. The moral duty has been assigned to you by, quote unquote, a divinity, in this case, Krishna himself. So, discipline is imposed for Tagore in the drawing from the Upanishad. Discipline comes from within. There is no autonomy of the individual. There is no questioning, doubt rather. What the Greeks called aporia, radical doubt. There is no question of that. Tagore in 1932 posed this question in a very famous poem called Question, Proshno. And where he says, the poem is addressed to God, where he says, generation after generation, you have sent emissaries to the world who have come and said, forgive, love. We have listened to this. But absolutely towards the end, he says, but those who are blowing out your light, those who are making your air toxic, যাহারা তোমার নিবাইছে আলো বিষাইছে তব বায়ু তুমি কি তাদের ক্ষমা করিয়াছ তুমি কি বেসেছো ভালো have you loved them have you forgiven them so this is a radical doubt of course unanswerable and unanswered but Tagore's piety was capacious enough for him to ask this question or such questions.
Skepticism also
comes from the Upanishad. But Gandhi believed that, as he wrote himself, not a blade of grass moves without the will of God.
I'm just adding a little anecdote which my mother quotes in her book on Shantiniketan, that as children they were all, in the morning there was a morning assembly in the Sinha Sadan I think, and they all had to sing these hymns which were composed by Tagore himself. And she said, in all the years that I was there, I never saw any child jostle or giggle, or which is what school children do. And she said, such was the aura of the Tagore magic that our freedom actually made us more disciplined. That's really the story that I was reminded of when you spoke of that. I'm sorry we are running out of time. Quickly, if there are any questions. If anybody would, yes, sure.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried. So, ভীষণ ভালো লেগেছে আপনার session. Excellent, all of you. I just have one question. I think in Tagore's poem Bangumata, he has the last two lines was রেখে চু বাঙালি করে মানুষ করো. So, I need to translate. You kept us as Bengalis, but you haven't really made us humans, exactly. And so I would like to request you to tell me, tell us all, I guess, what did he mean by that when he said, "Rekhecho Bangali kore manush koroni"?
Oh,
Thank you.
I would like to link that and take that second line. You haven't made them human beings. What I was saying earlier. Think of the whole of humanity. Just don't think of yourselves as Bengalis, but think of yourself as being a part of the wider body of humanity. That's what he was trying to say. That's my sense of it.
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
So, any other brief questions quickly if the house is open for.
Shall we wind this up there? Okay, yeah, sure. I had one question to add to, well, one observation to add to what you say. You know, it's always puzzled me why Tagore, who really belonged to all of us, has been completely appropriated by Bengal. This is something that I feel very sorry about, you know. I mean, partly because my mother has told us such wonderful stories about the time that she spent in the ashram. And what Rudrangshu and Aikant have, that there was a kind of, enormity of vision, of acceptance of all kinds of people. And now if you see the Bengali, the state of Bengal itself, I am not blaming all Bengalis, but there is something in that tradition where you are unwilling to share what you have and unwilling and also to look down upon the rest of India. You know, all Bengalis feel they are the most cultured, the most wise, the most...
Absolutely.
Which might well be true. Excuse me, I'm not saying that it's not true. But, you know, for them to accept anyone else at par or somebody who may have a better idea is a very difficult acceptance. So think about that.
Yeah, you're right what you're saying. It's an Obangali. Shobai hocche Obangali. I mean, they're not Bengalis. That's the, you know.
No, they will insist on all Bengali important texts being translated into other languages. But I don't know how many other Bhasha languages have been translated into Bengali.
Exactly.
So, Ira, if I may add to that, without at all disagreeing with you. Okay, so one problem is that for a very, very long time, Rabindranath was not translated. And he himself is a very poor translator of his own works. You just have to read his translations of Gitanjali, which I know Yeats loved, Ezra Pound loved, but those of us who can read Bengali, we can see that he's not even conveying the power and the poignancy of even 50% of what is there in the Bengali prose. How do you translate it? I mean, this is not from Gitanjali, but his very last poem, untranslatable. তোমার সৃষ্টির পথ রেখেছো আকীর্ণ করি বিচিত্র ছলনা জালে হে ছলনাময়ী. How do you translate cholona? How do you translate cholona? I can't think of an English equivalent of cholona. How do you do it? You know, so that is part of the problem. The style, and Tagore was a very self-conscious stylist, and he changed his style again and again. I mean, the great novel, which we all love, Shesher Kobita, অমিতের বাপ ছিল দিগ্বিজয়ী ব্যারিস্টার. Bap, can you translate that into English? If you say papa, if you say pa, it doesn't convey that colloquialism that Bap conveys. You can't do it. So that's part of the problem with Tagore.
No, it's also part of the problem that you think that only Bengalis can translate.
Yeah, yeah. No, but it's a problem. It's the problem of with all great writers. Try translating Shakespeare into Bengali; it won't work. And as scholars are showing, previous translations of, say, Proust, Remembrance of Things Past by. Now they are saying it. What we read originally of Proust is a wholly inadequate translation. They are now doing retranslations of the translation. So this is a problem with great works of literature, and it's particularly acute with Rabindranath. But because we have, Bengalis have been possessive about him.
But even Yeats,
To put
you
it
see,
mildly.
even Yeats, after his initial enthusiasm for Tagore,
He withdrew.
in 1934 he says, "Damn Tagore."
Yeah, damn Tagore. He withdrew
No,
that.
I agree that there are certain texts which should be left in the language that they were written in, because they have an emotional quotient which cannot be translated. But equally, there are others which would be marvelous if they were translated by some good translator. I'm not talking of era translators.
Imagine tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow in Bengali. Kalke, kalke, abar kalke. What does it convey? Nothing.
There speaks the Bengali.
If I may add something to what the way you posit have appropriated. It's open. I said, ma'am, the way you have posited the thing that Bengalis have appropriated, it's open to all of us to appropriate. Nobody has stopped us. It depends on how we appropriate, and
I
the
said
Chalana
he's
and the
a-
Bab can easily be translated in most of the Indian languages. So it's not. It's our shortcoming. It's not the overpowering Bengalis only who
Sure, I mean,
sometimes think, as you said, that
the blame lies on all of us.
on all of us.
And I
No,
was
also
talking
we are
this
so
morning
possessive
to-
and prickly. You see, Khushwant Singh says something about Tagore, Bengalis go mad at him. How does it matter? How does it matter on anything that Khushwant Singh says?
No, no, Abhi, I mean, whether you should call him Rabindranath Thakur or you should call him Rabindranath Tagore is really not the battlefield that it can become. Huh? So it starts from there, that only we know Thakur. How can you call Thakur Tagore, anglicized idiot? Anyway, please, this was entirely to loosen up and lighten up the thing. I'm so impressed by your how you've studied and accepted the differences, but also given space to both these grand people who will always, always remain the creators of India, of modern India. Yes? So with that, with your permission, Rudrangshu, and yours, Dr. Aishant, I conclude this session. Let's hope that we can continue this argument another day.
Thank you. Thank you,
Satish,
ma'am.
thank you so much.
So guys, please have a big round of applause for all of our esteemed panelists. And towards the end, we were having some wonderful discussion. So surely no one wants to leave. But समय और आयोजन की अपनी मर्यादा है. But before we leave, I would like to request Curator Value of Words, Dr. Sanjeev sir, to present a token of love and to say a humble dhanyavad by giving. Sir, it's there.
She's in charge of this hall.
That, So thank you, sir, and thank you, audiences and all of our panelists. In 15 minutes, next 15 minutes in this hall, we'll be starting with our next session, which will be insightful in the same manner and brainstorming also. The session is The Many Ideas of India, Text That Shaped Our Nation. So guys, in 15 minutes or so, we'll be meeting in this hall. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.